Elden Ring is one of my favorite games of all time. But around the time that I was playing it, I wasn't doing reviews on the channel, and so that's why we're getting to this fairly late. I do still know that there's quite a few people within my circle, or even those of you that watch my videos, that are still kind of on the fence with Elden Ring. So I kind of wanted to sway that opinion a bit, because I 100% endorse and recommend that you play Elden Ring. I'll talk about the things that are kind of stupid with the game, because there are definitely flaws with it, but I also wanted to make the idea of playing a Souls-like game a little less intimidating. Frankly speaking, I could very easily see Elden Ring being a lot of people's introduction into the Souls-like genre. While there are a lot of Souls-like games in name, FromSoft are the original creators of the genre, and in my opinion are the masters of it as well. Like, there's games like Remnant and Neo that do a decent job being a Souls-like, but they just don't have the same level of care. Everyone's copying what FromSoft did rather than innovating on top of it. And of course, one of the most important aspects of Elden Ring is that it's the first Souls-like open world game. While open world games are a dime a dozen, there's only a handful of open world games, I would say, that went open world because they needed to be open world. Elden Ring is one of those few games. Now, for those of you that are intimidated by the idea of playing such a difficult game, I want you to keep in mind that Elden Ring is one of the most accessible Souls-like games to date. Lots of people refer to it as one of the easier Souls-like games, which I tend to disagree with. Like, let's take Dark Souls 3 for example. This is a linear game where anytime you end up coming across a more difficult boss, all you can really do is grind the enemies around you and try to hopefully compensate for your lack of skill with fighting a new boss by having high enough stats that you can just tank through it. But let's say that there's like some god tier weapon that you want in order to fight the boss, but it being a linear game means that that god tier weapon is probably after that boss. Elden Ring doesn't really have that problem because it's open world. So anytime you end up coming across a difficult boss, you can just leave and go grind like hundreds of other smaller dungeons. You'll not only be a lot stronger by the time you rematch that boss, but you'll also have a crap ton more equipment. And oh my god, there's like hundreds of weapons and spells and armor combos that you can do in this game. Not to mention you can dual wield a weapon in one hand, a spell in the other, or just two different weapons or two of the same weapon. Like, it's crazy. On top of that, there's also these Ash of War, which is basically like a weapon special move. Some of these power attacks are baked into the weapon, and then other weapons can be swapped freely between the other power attacks that you have. Ash of War can also force a weapon into scaling off of a different stat. So for example, you might find a weapon that scales off of Faith and you're a strength build. If you can change the Ash of War on that weapon, you can make it so that it scales off of strength. Again, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is an easy Souls-like, it's just the fact that it gives so many options to the player makes it a lot more tolerable. But let's talk about the game's structure. So it is open world and there's hundreds of small dungeons, but there's a handful of legacy dungeons. These legacy dungeons are like the main dungeons of the game that are fully fleshed out, huge, gigantic castles that usually end with a god tier boss. These bosses are required for progression so that you can get to the end game area. But even then, there's so many optional zones, including a secret end game area that has the hardest boss in the game. Now, if it is still a little too intimidating for you to take this game on alone, you can always take it on with friends. You also have the option of summoning random players as well. While the co-op is amazing, there are some downsides, including some dated mechanics that FromSoft just can't let go of for some reason. One being that if you have a co-op player in your world, you can get invaded by another player that is there to kill you. And unfortunately, now that the game has been out for such a long time, most of the people that invade you usually have some god tier meta cheaty build. Sometimes you'll get a fair fight, but usually when you get invaded on the early portion of the game, it's just by some scumbag who's using like the last boss weapon. But the main issue that I have with the co-op is it is jank as hell. FromSoft has barely evolved how their co-op mechanics work since Dark Souls 1, and I hate it. What should be as simple as opening up a pause menu and joining in on your friends instead has you place down a summon sign and have the receiving player have to consume a certain item so that they can then see that summon sign and pull you into their world. That's all well and good, but my main issue is the fact that this is an open world game, and mechanically, it doesn't seem like the co-op was designed very well. Like, if you summon your friend in the open world and you're exploring together, first of all, you don't have access to your mount when you're in co-op, and if you try to enter a cave or even one of the big legacy dungeons, there's going to be an invisible wall that prevents you from going in. It's a simple enough workaround where your friend just has to leave the world, go into the dungeon, and then place their summon sign down again for you to call them into your world. But the fact that it has those unnecessary extra steps is just dated as all hell. Not to mention, if you're in that cave or just exploring with your friend and an invader does come around and kill you, then you still have to just go through the whole process all over again. But despite these issues, Elden Ring still stands tall as the best in its genre. Lastly, I did want to mention that in my recent reviews, I've kind of gotten rid of the whole numeric arbitrary score system. As an individual and not part of a big corporation like IGN, I feel like a numeric value towards these games just doesn't really make sense, because what is a review other than just sharing my subjective opinion? My scoring system usually ended up going up to a 5 because, frankly speaking, I think that 10 is too many numbers. Most games average out to being a 2 or a 3 in my opinion, with only a handful of games being a 5 out of 5, and Elden Ring obviously falling under that category. And I cannot wait to revisit the Lands Between when Shadow of the Erdtree comes out later this year.